Hello there everyone, well here we are at long last to talk about a theory that, more than any other I think, has left such a huge impression on me, and it's really helped to broaden my appreciation of human origins, and that of course is the bicameral mind theory by the American psychologist Julian Jaynes. This video is just going to be an elementary introduction into the essential tenets of bicameral theory so that we've got a basic framework for what we're going to be talking about going forward. And before I do that, I just want to quickly tell you about how I'm going to structure this. Basically, my mission here is to try and create one of the best resources for bicameralism on YouTube. So that means that I'm going to have to make plenty of videos, and that shouldn't be very difficult because it's quite a broad topic. Though I also appreciate that not everyone who comes to my channel here might be as into it as much as others, and so I'll still be continuing on with all of my other topics on here as well, such as my art and culture related videos and my archetype series videos as well. So it will go one bicameral video, one video on another topic, then another bicameral video, another video on another topic, and just proceed on like that until I've exhausted everything that I have to say on this issue. Alright then, so with that out of the way, let's get on to talking about the theory itself. Now I realise that even though this is the first video in the series, it might actually be one of the hardest, because what I've got to try and do here is concisely encapsulate a theory like bicameralism and at the same time do it justice. And that by no means is an easy task, because the theory in essence doesn't encapsulate the theory in substance, if that makes sense. In other words, we can't simply open up a Wikipedia page on bicameralism and mistake that definition as an artifact of what the theory actually entails, any more that we can open up a dictionary definition for schizophrenia, because the definition doesn't actually describe what schizophrenia is as a phenomenon. It merely strips out all of the substance and the nuance and hones in on certain choice elements that we can call on to characterize that subject. And I remember when I first read the book that the theory comes from, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And what originally attracted me to it was the sheer wildness of it. But as my understanding of it developed and I became more engrossed and impressed with the sheer substance and seriousness by which the subject was being described, by the end of reading the book, I remember lying on my back, looking up at the ceiling and saying to myself, I have no idea of what a human being is. Jaynes's book opened me up to the ambiguity of my arrangements, that all of this time I'd been walking through this life surrendered to the naive assumption that I knew who I was, I knew what I was, and that being situated inside the reassuring incubator of my own culture as I was, that I had enough of this figured out. You know, we like to indulge in this preoccupation about ourselves as reasonable and open-minded creatures, and that if controversial evidence comes our way, then we'll simply rearrange to suit the facts. But that's nonsense in practice, because we all carry inside of us the impressions of our culture, and that shapes our perception about human beings and previous generations of human life into proportions that make it seem to us like we grasp them properly. And we might watch these films like Troy and 300 that are supposed to convincingly depict to the eyes of the living the images of people now long gone, and we can say, oh well, it's just a movie, all we like. On a certain level of our minds, we do call on these impressions when we think about them, and it structures the way that we reason about past humans and how we see ourselves in contrast to them. And then we could say, well, yeah, movies are not very reliable when it comes to thinking about past peoples, but that's why we have the serious stuff like history books, and that's why we have these specialized disciplines like archaeology that can call up all of these vast monuments out of the ground, and when our eyes fall upon the reliefs of structures like Stonehenge or Eleusis or Tenochtitlan, we again begin to generate all these impressions that persuade us about what those people were like and what those societies might have been like. We can't easily escape the pressure of our impressions, and that to a large degree, our minds have been colonized by culture. And you might be able to intuit all of the problems with this. We can't be so confident that the impressions that we entertain about the past are always as reliable as we'd like them to be, whether they come from a television set or even from a specialist. Just because we might have some pottery from the Bronze Age doesn't mean that we understand what living in the Bronze Age was like, because that's an existential question that we simply can't generate hard evidence for. What we can do, of course, is speculate and make all kinds of inferences, and those inferences may coagulate into attractive theories like the one that we're going to be talking about here. But the thing that I'm really trying to force into our minds as a standard for how we proceed is to open ourselves to the benefits of remaining ambivalent in the face of what we don't understand. Ambivalence is our friend in theory more than the reassurances of naive certainty, because ambivalence situates us inside the foundations of our own ignorance and asks us to be flexible with our models. It doesn't mean getting rid of skepticism either. It simply asks that we don't fall back into the naivety and rigidity that harms our ability to speculate honestly. So with ambivalence as our protective amulet, what can we say? Well, think about some of the things that we've said already. What we're trying to do is speculate over questions of origin, specifically as it pertains to the origins of our mental framework. What did this, our present human psyche and consciousness, arise from? Well, we can start by saying that if we can be persuaded by the basic tenets of evolution that there is a structural heritage to our biological systems that unites our anatomy back into simpler forms of life, then we can also reason that our psychic systems have not always been the same as well. However, the problems facing us in this are severe. Not only are there philosophical issues with these kinds of things, our intrigue also suffers under the fact that it's one thing to own a piece of evidential data about some past peoples like a skull or a spearhead. It's another thing entirely to possess an intimate understanding of their state of life as they experienced it. And the questions that arrive from that, such as what was their mentality like and was it the same as ours? It's impossible to say for certain because, unlike buried remains that we can dig up from the ground, the evidence of experience is inaccessible. And in the hopeless absence of that kind of evidence, many of us just fall back on the assumption that, well, they were more or less like ourselves, just less educated, more superstitious versions of what we are today. And going back to our movie thing again, when we see an actor like Brad Pitt dressed up as Achilles, no matter how much he might be trying to put on an authentic impression, we are not looking at an authentic representation of a young Grecian warrior from that period. He is a modern configuration of a man fitted into an old jacket. And he has a modern mindset. He has modern inflections, modern mannerisms, modern ways of speaking. He, as well as all the other actors, are anatomically and psychically modern creatures, play acting as ancients. And if you were to take any of those characters in the film and drop them inside a modern city like New York and put them in modern clothing, we wouldn't see anything too out of the ordinary. Sure, they might be considered a bit eccentric if they always spoke in the poetic overtones of a movie, but we'd still be able to relate to them because we both have that essential foundation. But if you did the same for someone who actually lived in the period of the Trojan War, would it be so easy for us to relate? It would be more like taking a primitive from the Amazon jungle and bringing them into a big city. And what I'm saying here is that if we were able to speak to an ancient, the culture shock would be both ways. It would seem to us, probably even more so than a primitive, that we are interacting with an intelligence that looks human, but who, upon closer inspection, doesn't really coordinate with our modern categorizations of what being a human is. And I mean that at the most intimate level, beyond the pale of the physical. I mean at the level of our psychic substance, at the level of each other's consciousness, at the level of each other's being. We might seem so different to each other that we would have to regard the other as alien. We see all over our world the striking dissimilarities between people of different cultures, different outlooks on life, and between the different age generations too. Even with comparisons that we can make today, when we look for it, we always see this incredible flexibility and adaptability and dynamism to the frequency of people's interior arrangement. And yet, it's all occurring in anatomically modern human beings with modern brains and modern nervous systems and a modern consciousness. So considering all that, we have to question, why do we hold on to the idea that people who lived in the remote past were more or less like ourselves? It requires such an enormous stretch of the imagination and against all available data to hold to such a view that it even eclipses the audacity of a theory like bicameralism itself. If humans are so differential now, in their present-day anatomic and psychic configuration, then how different or how the same were we before this modern iteration came into being? That is the question that bicameral theory tries to answer, and it does so through a remarkably wide-reaching and surprisingly sophisticated network of supportive evidence, ranging from obviously historical and cultural reliefs, but also contemporary psychological and linguistic interpretations and neuroscience. Julian Jaynes's theory posits that what we would come to recognize as our modern mental architecture and consciousness is a recently new development on the human scene, only emerging since the second millennium. And before that, human beings possessed a different two-chambered system, which he called the bicameral mind. And that's where we get the bi from, because it's essentially structured in two parts. Without going into too much detail, since this is really just setting up the pieces with which we'll dive deeper into later on, the bicameral model offers that these types of humans didn't possess the same interiorizing function that we do now, which is this ability to draw inwards, to stop and consider, to abstract and subjectively speculate, and so on. Their consciousness was not as flexible as ours is today, but instead oscillated between two major operators. One in the right hemisphere, which carried interpretive information over into the adjacent language centers in the left, and what we, as anatomically modern humans, would call an interior solution, was experienced by bicameral humans as an auditory hallucination, which told the person what they should do. So what we would experience as an incoming problem, which we would then attend to, bring into ourselves and subjectively interact with within an introspective space, only then to be offered a solution which we would then apply to the problem at hand. That was not all there in bicameral humans. They would still be able to problem solve. They could still come awarded with a capacity for revelation, inspiration, creativity, perhaps even genius. But because of a lack of subjective interiorization, all of this was subconsciously processed and returned back into their primitive consciousness as a voice which gave them the solution. And so the earliest foundations of human culture and civilization were laid by the hands of unconscious automata, obediently responding to admonitory instructions generated by the hallucinated activity of their own nervous systems, and which to them culturally was inspired to be coming from the voices of gods or dead ancestors, especially ancestors which previously held titles of authority, such as dead kings, for instance. In fact, when we use the word gods in bicameral terms, we have to think differently, because to us, regardless of whether we're theistic or atheist, we have this conception, or should we say a post-bicameral conception, of a god as existing somewhat elsewhere. But for a bicameral human, a god was something as intimate and ever-present to them as the feeling of breath arising from your own lungs, or a vivid dream, for instance. It was a more poignant aspect of their lives than we can possibly empathize with from our view today. And where we see later on all of these religious expressions like prayer and divination come into the scene, these are all post-bicameral efforts to restore a lost point of connection between the minds of man and their gods, which in earlier civilizations' records were notably absent because they had no reason to exist. And they had no reason to exist because the god or dead ancestor was always there, walking with you like a speaking shadow in your mind. And ultimately, out of the turmoil and collapse of those earlier bicameral civilizations arose a new form of self-reflective consciousness that helped us to adapt to the demands of our newer, larger-scale developments. So the bicameral mind isn't merely some oddity of our evolutionary heritage. It, like the vestiges of our skeleton, which speaks to an earlier animal body, is something that continues to inform us into the modern period. And just as it has helped to lay the substrates of our earliest civilizations, it substrates the very consciousness with which we experience life through today. So there we have it. There was my attempt to give a concise description of the bicameral mind theory to you. I think I've done an okay job, though I have to reiterate that it is impossible to convey this theory over in a simple way and do it justice. We can't take this theory just on the basis of this video, because we have to consider all of the supporting evidence that surrounds it before we pass judgment on it. And I guarantee you, by the end of all of these videos, it's going to make you think differently. And it's going to make you reconsider your preconceptions about what you thought a human being was and where we've come from. Or should I say, what we've come from. Richard Dawkins has actually read this book, and he said something that I completely agree with. He said that depending on your position, by the time that you finish reading this book, it is the most interesting or the most insane theory that you will likely ever hear in your life. And yeah, I completely agree with Dawkins on that. It's a very provocative book, but it's also a very well-reasoned book, and it's very substantial. This is not just fringe theory. Julian Jaynes was a very rigorous thinker, and it's a very well-argued theory, and I'm going to do my best to try to convey over the style and substance which is in this book, so that you can be impressed with it in video form as much as I have in book form. And maybe you'll think of picking up a copy of The Origin of Consciousness yourself and have a go at reading it. Though for now, I've done what I came here to do, so I'm simply going to say thank you very much for watching this video. Stick with it, and let's explore this theory of bicameralism together. But for now, I'm just going to say thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.